Welcome back to Unplanned for another episode of what I'm calling a sort of profile series. Interesting people in the Boston metro area who are doing interesting things. And today we have a return guest, Jesse Kanson-Benanav, who is going to tell us all about his work and everything he's been doing. I've known Jesse now for many years.
Yeah.
Urban planner, very active. I mean, that doesn't even quite get at it in the housing space.
Yeah.
And Jesse, welcome back to Unplanned.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.
All right, so what we want to do today is just kind of do a, hey Jesse, who are you? What are you up to? And what's going on in your world? So why don't you give the good people just a little intro about some of the work you're doing right now?
Sure. So I'm Jesse Kanson-Benanav, as you said. I'm the executive director of Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. We're a statewide pro-housing organization. We recognize that there's a severe housing shortage that's driving our housing affordability crisis in Massachusetts. We haven't built enough homes for people throughout the Commonwealth for generations now, and that's gotten us to this really bad spot where, you know, the lack of housing in communities is, you know, driving displacement. It's pitting people across the income spectrum against each other for a very limited supply of housing. We're not building enough affordable housing. We're not building enough, you know, workforce, middle-income housing. And honestly, we're not building enough just market rate or even high-end housing. We're focused on what are the local and state policy mechanisms that we need to change in order to build the housing that Massachusetts residents now and in the future need.
All right, so we'll get into all that.
Okay.
But we're going to do a little walk down memory lane.
Sure.
Because you and I both know each other from our days in being active in Cambridge
politics, yes.
Which includes an organization which still exists, I believe, although I have not been involved with them, A Better Cambridge.
Yes, they do still exist.
So why don't you give us all just a little recap from your memory of your days as the leader and I think one of the founders of A Better Cambridge.
Yeah, I was one of the founders, and I was the first sort of chairperson of the organization. So, so A Better Cambridge is a volunteer, citizen-led sort of neighborhood association, but, you know, resident group in Cambridge. You and I were both on the board at one time. The story with A Better Cambridge ABC started in 2012. I can't remember if you were on the council at that point or not. I've lost track.
No, I think I was no longer on the city council, and I think that there was a conversation around housing because there has been a conversation around housing for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And I think people like you, like me, others felt that needed to be part of the political conversation in a more effective way. And that's kind of my reflection.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, specifically, like for me personally, like I moved to Cambridge in 2004. You know, I would say from 2004 to 2012, because I worked in the housing space, I didn't really get involved in those issues in Cambridge, but I was a politically involved person, worked in your campaign, Cambridge Democrats. So, you know, I paid attention to what was going on in the city, and there was always this thing that struck me that whenever there was a new housing development proposed, it could have been 100% affordable LIHTC development or, you know, market rate mixed income development, but no matter what, whenever there was a new housing development proposed, there was strong backlash, the classic NIMBYism that we hear, concern about parking, traffic, shadows, whatever it may be. And that really, for me, didn't jive with like what I believed Cambridge purported itself to be as this progressive, welcoming, inclusive community, one of the early sanctuary cities in the United States. Like, how can you be this open and welcoming community if you're not actually building homes for people to be open and welcomed into? Right. So that struck me. I will say I never really got involved in those issues until 2012. It was that summer. There was a group of homeowners in Central Square, from my perspective, I think you would agree, like one of the more urban neighborhoods of all of greater Boston.
Right.
Like direct access to Harvard, MIT, downtown Boston.
And the T, of
course. And the T, social services, school, so much there. It's the kind of neighborhood we would want to give more people the opportunity to live in for equity, sustainability, all sorts of reasons.
Right.
But again, this group of homeowners, primarily in Central Square, that didn't like some of the Kendall Square development that had happened proposed this petition to downzone Central Square, right? Reduce heights and density.
And we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to jump ahead a little bit.
Sure.
So you're very active in that stuff.
Yeah.
You also are an urban planner by training.
Yes,
you did
by
a
training.
You did a.
I have a master's in city planning from
MIT. So that had you in Cambridge for that.
Kept me in Cambridge, yep.
And we'll get back to the Central Square story,
Okay.
but let's jump to the abundant housing, because that's really what you're doing now. And you've taken a lot of the themes from your earlier work in local politics, local activism into a kind of more of a statewide.
Yeah. Well, it was the work that I did from like 2012 to 2019 with ABC that sort of led to it. It was a progression. It was a progression of my career and a sort of merging of my career and volunteer work in Cambridge through ABC. Basically, while we were running ABC, there was a few groups around the region that had popped up that were doing similar things in other communities. Somerville, Brookline, Newton, couple others, couple in Boston. But there was no sort of like umbrella or coalition, convener, capacity builder sort of organization to help these really bootstrap, all volunteer grassroots groups do their work and be effective in their communities. And so a number of things happened, but ultimately I and a group of my original board of directors, we got together in 2019 into 2020, started planning for what might it look like to create a rather unique organization that's representing the like grassroots pro-housing or YIMBY individuals and organizations around the region and help building up that movement some more. What would it look like to create that? And that's ultimately what led to Abundant Housing Massachusetts.
Well, before we get into that in more specifics, let's spend a minute on YIMBY and YIMBYism and the YIMBY conference, which also plays into the history of this stuff. And I definitely participated. You actually, with a group, a sort of organizing group, brought that to the Boston area, but that's also interesting. So tell us a minute about YIMBY and YIMBYism.
Yeah, so YIMBY means yes in my backyard. It's a sometimes controversial term. We don't use it quite as much anymore in the abundant housing space. We tend to say pro-housing more, but we're certainly of that movement. This is a movement, I would say, that began maybe around the time or a little bit into the time we were involved with A Better Cambridge, but it sprouted up in the Bay Area of San Francisco, Boston, maybe New York, a couple other regions. Think like high-cost coastal cities that had not produced enough housing, but were generating lots of jobs and had people moving to them. So it really threw off that sort of supply demand scenario. And so, it was a movement really of like non-planners for the most part, activists, younger people, very frequently, who were just concerned about the sort of entrenched NIMBYism and NIMBY control of local politics in places like San Francisco, Oakland, Cambridge, other areas, that said we need, as the younger generation who's struggling to afford places, that can't imagine ever buying a home in our 20s or 30s like our parents or grandparents did, like we need to get involved in this conversation and push for more housing and push for reforming zoning and sort of the other mechanisms that allow or don't allow homes to be built. And so that was that movement.
Yeah, and let's just spend a second on something that I remember very strongly from ABC days, A Better Cambridge, is yes, more affordable is crucial.
Yep.
But more housing in general is crucial.
Yeah.
And I remember some very strong moments in the course of the ABC days where it really was an argument of like, everybody is looking for housing. It is, of course, if you don't have resources, it's that much harder and that much more crucial in a lot of ways. But it's not just in that sector. Yeah. And I don't know what your perception of all that has been over your now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely true. That's our focus as an organization at Abundant Housing. It's certainly what we did at A Better Cambridge. Everyone needs a home. Everyone needs a home that they can afford. We have not built enough homes across the income spectrum, not just in Cambridge, but across Massachusetts for generations. And what that has meant is that we have this scenario where wealthy folks, maybe newcomers to Boston, attracted to the biotech or maybe financial services industry. They're moving here. Again, we have hundreds of thousands of homes short of where we should be. So like they're looking, oh, what can I rent or own? And they're competing for maybe a condo in a triple decker or a whole triple decker that a generation or two or three ago was like the workforce housing. It was low cost, like mass produced housing that working families could afford. We don't have any naturally occurring affordable housing anymore because low-income folks, certainly in Boston and Cambridge and throughout the region, have to compete with wealthier folks for this very limited stock of homes that does exist. And who's going to win in that competition? It's going to be the wealthy folks who bid up the price of housing. We've seen that for years in the homeownership market in Greater Boston, where you list your home, it goes on the market. You have an open house the next weekend, and then hundreds of people show up.
These stories are terrifying.
Oh my God.
A friend of mine is a new mother, actually just had her second child, grew up in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Her parents were immigrants from overseas. They were able to buy a triple decker in the 60s or the 70s.
Right.
Raised their two children there. There's no way she could afford to live in Cambridge. She was looking at houses. A house she looked at sold for $140,000 over asking cash.
Yeah.
Exactly. And she's like, I have a good job. I could never do that.
Exactly.
I could never do that.
So people are paying, well over asking in cash, no contingencies, no inspection. We've seen that for years in the ownership market, and that's a direct result of very, very limited supply of ownership opportunities, wealthier people just bidding that up and basically taking ownership out of possibility for working people in Massachusetts.
Well, let's jump in. What are you working on now? So you've got this organization.
Yeah.
And tell us anything you want about that organization. It's getting into the statewide debate and discussion.
Yeah.
And I also want to hear about what the governor's task force, which I just saw you were appointed to that.
Yeah.
But what are you working on now? What's the tasks you've got in front of you?
Couple things. So we sort of focus on two overarching buckets. One is local organizing, right? As you know, in Massachusetts, land use planning, development approvals, zoning, etc. It's all local. 351 cities and towns, 351 different legislative bodies, planning boards, zoning boards that make their own decisions in a vacuum, thinking about their borders generally without concern for their neighbors or the broader housing market. And so we recognize that if we want to have positive change, get more housing built, approved and built, reform local zoning to make it quicker and more affordable to build homes, and moderate the cost of buying or renting homes, we need advocates on the local level with the resources, understanding to fight for these things, to educate their neighbors, and just be involved in the conversation. So that's our first bucket, is grassroots organizing. We have hundreds of members around the state now, about 20 affiliate organizations, including A Better Cambridge and others, and growing every day. Our second overarching bucket is state policy. While we recognize the critical importance of organizing at the local level, the reality is that the scenario we live in, where towns have so much control over zoning and land use, is a choice made over generations on Beacon Hill. Chapter 40A is the state zoning code. The state zoning code, or zoning law, gives municipalities almost complete control over what they do with zoning and how they allow it to approve or not approve more housing from being built in their borders. So,
can I just say, I believe I've been doing unplanned for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
I think this is the first time that Chapter 40A has been mentioned by name
in
all of
well,
these.
I'm glad that.
And it's absolutely key. It's critical to a lot of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. We need to follow the example that other states, from California to Montana to Vermont and Maine and others, have done, where the state has said, municipalities, you are abusing local control and you are preventing homes from being built, which is driving up costs And we as the state are going to step in and say, there are certain areas that you local communities will not have complete control over, because just thinking about your existing community character or your own impact in your own backyard is not thinking globally, and has gotten us to the point where here in Massachusetts we have, I would say, we have in Greater Boston one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. Cambridge rents are really second to very few, maybe Manhattan and San Francisco. And that's a result, not just, I don't mean to call Cambridge out necessarily, but that's all a result of...
Why not?
Well, because Cambridge does do a lot, and I would say Cambridge now has a pro-housing city council that has made changes, and I think there are more changes to come. But also Cambridge is incredibly desirable, and so many people, the population has grown so immensely in Cambridge. And
I was just down in the Lechmere, at the Lechmere Tea Station. That, to call that a new neighborhood doesn't quite get at it. It's even more. It's even more.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We're going to pause for a second. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's at 2:00.
Okay, so you got enough time?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So give us a 3, 2, and Jesse. The other. Well, first of all, tell us what kind of reaction do you get when you come out with that message, that story. Are people in favor? Are people opposed?
I mean, it varies. It really varies from community to community. We have a lot of success in places like Cambridge and Somerville. I think, even in like Brookline, the conversation has been quite positive, even though there is some pushback. As we get further outside of the urban core, things are a little bit are harder. And, there is the concern about, there's a group, sort of anti-housing group that started in Gloucester called Don't Boston My Gloucester. The whole notion of we are not Boston and focusing on more housing, density, et cetera, is changing who we are as Gloucester. Now, I think that's probably misrepresenting the history of Gloucester, and I don't just mean to call it Gloucester, but it's an example of things do change as you get to other parts of the state. And
then briefly, as we wrap up this session, this brief profile, but this is really a profile to introduce you to some of the viewers of Unplanned, although you've been on before. You just got appointed to a governor's task force. I don't know exactly what it was called, but it's looking at housing. And tell us a little bit about that.
So it's a new commission that the governor created by executive order late last year. It's called the Unlocking Housing Production Commission. So, while the governor and the legislature are dealing with this housing bond bill, which they've called the Affordable Homes Act, which is a $4 billion investment in housing production in Massachusetts, that's working its way through the legislature right now. That's sort of just the beginning, as huge as that is, beginning of the conversation. And I think the administration recognizes that on the zoning front, on the building regulation front, on the permitting and other regulations, there are a lot of barriers that still exist and will still exist, even if the governor's ambitious housing bond bill is passed, that are barriers to producing the homes we need in Massachusetts. So we've only had one kickoff meeting of this commission, so more to come. But our task is to identify in a variety of buckets, not just zoning, even though that's where I tend to focus, that what are the barriers to producing the homes we need, and what are the solutions to overcoming them, with the intention of helping prepare the governor to take action, whether through executive order or through a legislative agenda in the next legislative session in 2025, with further steps to reform our system and make sure that we can begin to more fully address our housing shortage and build the homes we need.
Well, Jesse, I know for a fact there's a million more topics we could cover, and your depth of knowledge is great. It's impressive, and it also reminds me of all these conversations that are ongoing here in the state of Massachusetts and beyond. Thank you for coming back on Unplanned.
Yeah, anytime.
If viewers want to find out a little bit more about Abundant Housing Massachusetts, where would they go? Where do they go?
You can find us at abundanthousingma.org. That's our website, of course. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I don't think we have a what's the new one? We don't have a TikTok yet, but the legacy social media, you can find us. But go to our website, abundanthousingma.org is the best.
Well, thank you once again, and we look forward to getting you back on Unplanned.
Yeah,
sometime
anytime.
soon.
Thanks for having me, Sam.